American politics is broken. Rather than serving the people, some of our politicians spend their time name-calling, grandstanding, and pitting us against one another for partisan gain. We're losing trust in our political leaders, and increasingly, we no longer trust each other. We've seen the consequences: rancor, dysfunction, violence. Now we face another election year, and it feels like our democracy is hanging by a thread. Braver Angels is the nation's largest grassroots organization, bringing Americans together to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. Over the past 5 years, we've helped tens of thousands of Americans cross that divide, bringing everyday people together to talk, listen, and move beyond stereotypes. We've become a movement to change our politics for the better. And now, with your help, we're taking our movement directly into the political arena. Braver Politics is a national campaign to remake our politics from the ground up in a spirit of trust, citizenship, and goodwill. Over the next few months, we'll empower all Americans to fight for the change they want to see from our leaders. We'll bring candidates, elected officials, and their staffs together across party lines to build relationships, grow trust, and develop skills for honest, constructive communication with each other and with constituents. We've already begun to work with brave politicians at all levels of government, from school boards and city councils to state legislatures in the U.S. Congress. And this campaign season, we'll be engaging directly with candidates, holding discussions with voters, town halls, and debates. Together, we'll begin to change the culture of American politics and change the incentives that drive our politicians to tear us apart rather than bring us together. Whether you're a citizen or a politician, now is the time to stand up for America. Now is the time for Braver Politics. Join us at braverpolitics.org. Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. What you just heard is the script from the trailer announcing our newest initiative, Braver Politics. Over the past 5 years, Braver Angels has developed a proven model for bringing ordinary citizens together across the political divide. Now we're taking what's worked for us at the citizen-to-citizen level into the very institution of American politics, and engaging politicians at all levels of government. If you're interested in learning more and getting involved, check out braverpolitics.org. Over the course of the next few months, leading up into the 2022 election, you're going to start seeing thousands of Braver Angels fanning out across the country to engage candidates, elected officials, and their staffs. We'll be hosting red-blue workshops, town halls, discussions with voters, and of course, Braver Angels debates between candidates running for office. We're building a citizens movement, and I definitely encourage you to check it out. And now, for today's podcast, I spoke with Mark Beckwith. Mark is a longtime Braver Angel who previously served as Bishop of Newark, New Jersey. He's out with a new book called Seeing the Unseen, Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. He argues that instead of dismissing those whose views and experiences are different from our own, we must look directly at them and see the goodness that is inherent in all things. From the language we use to the imperative to understand and include, Mark says we have a duty to work through opposition and build community. I really enjoyed this conversation because it allowed me to step outside the normal bounds of political conversation and touch upon the deeper topics of religion, philosophy, meditation, and metaphysics, and what they can teach us about the current state of our culture, society, and shared life on Earth. So without further ado, I bring you Mark Beckwith.
Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ciaran. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you. I want to start by reading a brief passage from the beginning of the introduction to your book, in which you write, "There is something more important than having new ideas, and that is having new eyes. This book is all about having new eyes." Can you tell us more about what you mean by that?
I'll tell a story, and I think it's the genesis of this book. I was serving as the bishop of the Diocese of Newark in New Jersey, the Episcopal Church, and And we had an office downtown, and next to our office was a Catholic church that was not in use, but had a soup kitchen next door. And we shared a driveway. And in the first couple of weeks, I noticed the soup kitchen and the people coming to the soup kitchen, everybody was fed outside. And I noticed it because I had started soup kitchens, worked in soup kitchens. It's a big part of some of the work that I did. But then after 2 or 3 weeks, I didn't see it anymore. I literally didn't see it. And the men who were coming, mostly men, I didn't see because I was looking at something else. I was looking at this new responsibility that I had, all these congregations that I was responsible for, the problems, the opportunities. So I didn't see what was going on next door until a colleague, a priest in the diocese, came up to me one day and said, "What goes on next door?" And I said, "Oh, there's a soup kitchen." And she said, let's go. So we went not to serve, but to talk. And we had conversations with the men who were there. And what I learned is there were 250 men at breakfast and 250 men at lunch, and I didn't see them. And after we got together and debriefed our experience, she pointed her finger in my chest and she said, "Don't you dare go just once." And so I didn't. I started to develop a rhythm of going every week, spending time with these guys, building relationships, and was able to see them. And I'm so embarrassed to say that I hadn't seen them before. I literally hadn't seen them because I was focused on the things that I thought I needed to be focused on. And my eyes were open and my horizons were expanded because some of these men, not all of them, but many of them, lived with a level of faith and courage that had never been tested to that degree in me. And I learned so much from some of these guys that I otherwise hadn't seen.
And so from that experience, you started investigating this idea. And what are some of the themes that emerged as you were writing and thinking about the importance of not just thinking, but seeing others and regularly being able to receive others in their fullness?
Yeah, well, and I think we're trained, and I make a case in the book that some of our training comes from the philosophy of René Descartes in the 1600s, who came up with the phrase "cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. So we have put a great priority on thinking, and we're very, very good at it. Look at all the advances that we've had technologically and otherwise. But that has come at the expense of our able to see one another very effectively. And the story of René Descartes, the psychohistory, is that he was 14 years old, and the king of France died suddenly. Actually, he was murdered because the king of France was interested in and committed to having religious pluralism in France. Prior to that, it had been just a Catholic country. He was willing to allow other religious expressions to come in. This offended somebody, attacked his carriage, killed him. And he embodied the hope of the whole country. And it was the practice at the time that when someone like that was killed, the heart was removed and processed around the city so people could venerate it. Young René Descartes, age 14, saw this heart and it broke his own, the psychohistory says, and he vowed that he would never have his heart broken like that again. And that led to his notion, we need to think, we need to be distant from our heart, we need to not be connected with our heart, which inhibits how we are able to see one another.
And in addition to being a bishop, you're also a gun safety activist. And
Correct.
Obviously the issue of gun rights and gun safety is one of the most painfully divisive issues in our nation. Can you talk about the specific experiences you've had working in gun safety activism, where you've had to work with and think about and see people whose views and experiences might be directly opposed to the very change that you're seeking to implement?
That's a great question, and my commitment to this began more intentionally when the Newtown, Connecticut shootings happened at Sandy Hook, and began to form a network of other bishops around the country, and we're still in existence, Bishops United Against Gun Violence, and doing all that we can to reduce the scourge and the epidemic of gun violence. But as time went on, and I began to talk to people who were devoted to their weapons and keeping their weapons and the Second Amendment and all the rest of it, I thought, this is a world that I don't know. So one of the things that I did is I went to a gun show. I went to a gun show, and almost everyone at the gun show were presumably gun rights activists, sign up for the NRA, all of this sort of stuff. And as I walked through the gun show and listened to conversations, people were speaking a language that I didn't understand. Not that they weren't speaking English, they were speaking English, but they were referring to metaphors and systems and practices and experiences that I didn't have. And I didn't understand it. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is a fundamentally American, the relationship with guns. It goes back to the founding. And I don't know this language, and I don't know this culture. And from that moment on, I decided that I need to learn this language and this culture. And one of the things that I learned is that those of us who are passionate about gun violence prevention come across with an arrogance and a self-righteousness that just infuriates the other side, because it's an unwillingness to listen and to really be in relationship. One term that I have, I no longer use, and when I did use it maybe 8-9 years ago, someone who had been working in this field for a long, long time, actually his brother was an FBI agent in the early 90s. Somebody came into the FBI office in Washington, D.C., shot and killed 4 agents, one of whom was his brother. And I remember we're talking in conversation, I said, gun control, and he slapped me on the wrist. He said, please don't use that term. Because as soon as you use the term gun control, people line up on opposite sides of the room and conversation stops and people dig in. Please use gun safety. So ever since, I've been a proponent of using the term gun safety, and I've written to journalists and others, and some said, yeah, I get it, but the system is so not committed, but the practice, they're so habitualized to using the term gun control. And that term just makes it almost impossible to have a conversation where people can hear one another. So over the course of time, one thing that I've learned and I've seen, and where hope is emerging, is in the whole area of suicide. And I live much of the time in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire formed the first firearm safety coalition with public health people who presumably want to restrict the use of guns, and gun shop owners and gun trainers. And they've been around for 10 years because everyone has an interest in reducing the level of suicide. And over half of gun deaths in America are suicide, depending on where you go in the restriction or lack of restriction of gun laws, that number could go higher. Again, New Hampshire, 80% of gun deaths in New Hampshire are suicide. And so that is a place where people who profoundly disagree on the whole issue of guns have a place where they can meet and work together. And that the New Hampshire group, the Firearm Safety Coalition, has spawned 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other groups around the country where you have gun violence prevention people and gun rights folks working together to reduce this, because it's in everybody's self-interest.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the point about language is really important in this country. We're often speaking English with our political opponents, but we're speaking a different language. And in a universal context, it reminds me a little bit about the Tower of Babel and the passage from Genesis where it says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." As a bishop, for those who might not be familiar with that story or that passage, can you talk a little bit about what that means and how it might apply to the current moment?
Sure. That's in Genesis 9, the Tower of Babel. And people thought in their hubris, in their arrogance, that they could build a tower to heaven and presumably usurp the role of God, and they could manage creation on their own. God saw this and scattered them and such that people were speaking Babel. That's where the term comes from. We babble with each other, don't understand one another, to spread people around. It's interesting to note that the architects of apartheid in South Africa used that passage to justify the separation of races. There's a biblical warrant, they said, for us to be apart. And I remember Desmond Tutu, who I got to know early on, he used to say apartheid. It's hate of apartheid. It's obviously it's a Dutch word, but he Englishified it and said apartheid. So it's the justification to separate people. I see it as a story of our hubris, which runs throughout all of Scripture, actually, that we think that we can manage the world on our own. We don't need God, and God sort of spread us around and give us the challenge of, okay, how do we build relationships with one another if we're speaking different languages? And that is a challenge and has been a challenge for the human family. And Braver Angels has taken up that challenge in a unique way, such that people who come at issues with profound differences are finding a space where they can talk together, listen to one another, and learn from one another. It's I call it reconciliation, which is a biblical concept. That we can be reconciled with one another. In a world currently, certainly with social media and all the rest, where there are forces and voices that say, no, we can't be reconciled. We're too polarized from other. We're too different. One side needs to beat the other side, and one side needs to be vanquished over the other. And that is, to my mind, historical precedent shows it. That's a fool's errand. It doesn't work.
And so at a time when so many houses of worship have become politically divided, and some people have sought to use religion as a means to push an ideological agenda, what do you see as the role of faith in bringing people together when it comes to the political divide?
I'll respond to that in two ways. One is the word religion. The Latin root is religio. The practices, symbols, and thoughts that bind people together. Religion is that which binds people together. Now, we all know that every religion in the world has had moments when it's been just the opposite. When they've said, we have the truth and you do not. And so you need to subscribe to the truth. And if you don't subscribe to our truth, in the Middle Ages, the church would say, let them be anathema. We say they're contrary to the gospel. All of that stuff is in play. But I subscribe to the notion of religion in this Latin term, religio, that which binds us together. And a key component of that for me is in the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus says to his disciples, if you're bringing a gift to the altar, first put your gift down and be reconciled to your brother or sister. And then pick up your gift and come to the altar. So reconciliation is what needs to happen before one receives, in many ways, the most powerful symbol, at least for some Christian traditions, mine being one of them, of the bread and wine. That is a powerful symbol of life. Before we receive that, we need to be reconciled with one another. And in these religious communities, when you exchange the peace, which is really the enactment of what Jesus tells his disciples to do, it's an act of reconciliation. The person you exchange the peace with, even if you don't touch them or even see them, symbolically represents someone with whom you need to be at peace. And if the person you're standing next to you is someone you live with, often that's the person you most need to make peace with. But it is an act that says, at least in the Christian tradition, we exchange the peace, whatever separates us. And oh, sweet Jesus, there's a lot that separates us, can be brought together through this reconciling power of God that we can draw on.
I hear people ask, how can we have reconciliation without truth? How can I reconcile with someone when we don't share the same reality? What do you say to that?
Yeah, the founder of atomic physics was Niels Bohr, Danish physicist, and he said the opposite of a fact is a lie. 2 + 2 will never be other than 4. But he said the opposite of a truth is a competing truth. Abortion is murder. Abortion is a woman's right to choose. Jesus is fully human. Jesus is fully divine. Guns make people safer. Guns put us more at risk. Those are competing truths. Those are competing truths. And what then happens, and Braver Angels is a movement to do this. You take two competing truths, you bring them together, and something else can surface, can emerge from those competing truths. If people listen and are open to having their horizons expanded. And my experience with people who participate in Braver Angels is it's sort of self-selective in that people who are in Braver Angels from the left and from the right, they want to see this differently. So they're committed to a third point or a third way. In my book, I talk about the mandorla, which is an Italian word for almond. And it's the shape that's created when two circles intersect. Think of Venn diagram from 6th grade arithmetic. Two circles intersect, and that intersection forms an almond. These two circles are very, very prevalent in medieval art, not the halo, but the mandorla. And Jesus, the risen Christ, is often depicted in the mandorla, in this place in between. Originally, it was between heaven and earth, or good and evil. Today, in our world, I see it between red and blue, abortion opponents, pro-choice people, gun rights folks, gun violence prevention people. There is a mandorla. These two circles can never be the same, and they can never be separated. And to enter the mandorla is a place of separation. You cannot force people into this space. You can only invite them. And Braver Angels invites people into that space. And some people say, well, I'm not going to go in that space. I'd rather take refuge in my circle, in one side of the circle, where everybody I talk to, everybody I read says exactly what I think and reinforces what I think. And, Lord knows there are enough forces and voices on both sides that are advocating for people to stay in the safe part of the silo. But there are other people who say, no, we can live in a different way. We can live in a different way. We can find this center place not where we sacrifice our commitments, but or our positions, but we can find a space where we might find common ground, where we can work together. I just hold out great hope for that, and have seen that over and over again. Even one of the people I point to in my book is Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was very clear about what the problem was the injustice of segregation and all the elements that flowed from that. And in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he writes to a group of white clergymen and says to them, we all share this same faith, but we need to work together to come to this place where everyone is regarded as a brother and sister. Everyone has equal membership in the human family and American citizenship. And very brilliant in how he spoke to the injustice, but at the same time invited people in. He didn't shame people. He pointed them, as prophets do, to the injustice of what was going on, but invited people to see and think differently.
And are there specific experiences that you've had within Braver Angels where you've found yourself in that mandorla space and built relationships with people who you previously may have felt were far more different than you realized?
Yeah, there was one a debate a couple of years ago about the Second Amendment, and April Lawson asked me about how to frame the conversation, and I had some suggestions, and she said her group really wanted to talk about the Second Amendment. So as Braver Angels conversations go, somebody speaks in favor of the Second Amendment. I think the presenting question was, the Second Amendment should not be abridged under any circumstances. And several people said we're supportive of that. And I spoke early on in saying, no, that there needs to be other ways of looking at it. And the way it works is somebody speaks in favor and somebody speaks in opposition, and questions are not directed to the speaker, but to the chair, which mitigates against shaming or putting down the speaker. And as it went on, at first, as I was listening to people who had opposite views from myself, I was listening to them and fashioning responses to their arguments. And as the debate went on, I realized, oh my goodness, they really believe this. That's the level that we need to engage in the conversation. They really believe what they were saying. And up until maybe half hour, 45 minutes in, I was saying, how can they believe that? How can they say that? And as the debate went on, I was able to say, oh, they really do believe this. And so we're dealing on a level of profound belief. And so throwing facts and making political arguments isn't going to make a difference. It was getting to the point where, I could see this is a fundamental belief, a core part of a person's identity, which reframes the opportunity for a conversation and enabled me to see people differently. A similar sort of thing happened at the gun show, when I was able to see, these folks are deeply committed to guns. And it's not, the guns are sort of the manifestation of it, but it's deeper than that. It's a profoundly American reality. And the fear is, as I could sense it as I was going through the gun show, is that people on my end want to take that away, to just sort of erase that part of American culture. We can't do that. A, it's not going to work, and B, it shouldn't. We can make it different. We can provide opportunities for people to be safer. And as I said earlier, I think suicide is one place where there is some movement on that. But it's long and it's slow. And until we get to almost these religious commitments that people have, it's that deep in some people. Until we get to that, we're not going to be able to move things along.
And do you think these understandings and realizations that you've had, have they made you a more effective advocate, do you think?
That's a good question. I like to think so. I think there's some would say I'm now a less effective advocate because I don't agree with, but I honor sometimes the position of the other side. When I say sometimes, not always, but I think that's a key component. So I think that I see my role is trying to build bridges between those who have one opinion, those who have another, just creating a network of religious leaders. We're calling ourselves faith leaders for ending gun violence, and we're Christian, and we decided to be Christian, at least at the outset, because so much of the debate around guns comes within the Christian community. And we've pulled together a bunch of religious leaders from around the country who are so-called mainstream and some are evangelical. And we wouldn't agree on several issues, but we agree on this. And we want to be able to demonstrate that here we have different perspectives on scripture, on theology, but we have a common purpose on this. And so we're committed to that. One way we're doing that, it's symbolic. There are a growing number of blacksmiths around the country, and there are a growing number of gun buyback programs around the country. So people who bring their guns in, what these blacksmiths do is swords into plowshares, take the guns, forge them into garden tools. And usually there's a whole kind of ritual around it. We usually bring in people who've suffered gun violence to tell their story. And is that going to move the needle? I don't know. I hope it enables people to see differently, that there are other ways to see.
Mm. And so if I find myself engaging someone whose views I might not only disagree with, but whose views I may find dangerous or threatening, is there any practical advice you can give people about how to not just directly jump to the thinking and the fear, but also the seeing and the acceptance that you write about? Yeah,
well, I think it's the tension. This is perhaps an oversimplification between the ego and the soul. The ego is interested in order, wants to win, is resistant to change, where the soul is the place where creativity is born, where love comes from. And so often when we get in these polarized conversations, people are speaking from the ego, and I hear it and I respond with my ego. The first gun debate, I was one of two people on the gun violence prevention side, or two people on the pro-gun side. And I remember in that conversation, as I was going in it, I wanted to win. I wanted to win, and I had all the arguments that made me win. And afterwards, I was so distressed at that, because I could say, I suppose, that I did win, but I'd have to, sort of turn myself into a pretzel. And the two people on the opposite side could say the same thing. And as I was going through it, and as I reflected on it afterwards, no, where is there humility here? Where is the humility? And when I'm feeling pressure, it's hard to come up with humility. I want to win. I want to win. And this desire to win often creates more problems than it seeks to solve. And so that, and then I have all these spiritual practices where I'm brought to the depth of who I am and realize that I can really, through meditation, prayer, all the other things that I do, have more opportunity to live from the perspective of the soul as opposed to the ego, where I'm always being engaged and either feeling threatened or wanting to dominate or whatever. So I think that's practices that we need to engage in.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because I think so many of the practices in which we're currently engaged, just as a function of living in the society we live in and the information ecosystem we inhabit, feed the ego, right, and speak to the ego. You mentioned meditation and prayer. These seem like difficult practices that one has to intentionally and through discipline cultivate, because if one doesn't, one just falls again back into social media and the conditioning that seems to be accelerating. Mm-hmm. What is your advice to someone who is just at the beginning and has never gone to church and has never meditated? Are there sort of baby steps that one can take before suddenly trying to jump from the ego to the soul?
Yeah, no, and it takes a while to do that. I think just spend some time in silence. Mindfulness, which is a secular version of what I call contemplative prayer. I mean, there are all sorts of other avenues out there. Yoga, there's some physical practices that people can do. And a lot of people can't do it for very long. And usually something comes into the mind. Certainly it happens to me when I'm in silence in prayer, contemplative prayer. Some issue will hit me, and it used to be that I would punish myself for not paying enough attention. And what the spiritual teachers say from every tradition, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, go back to your prayer. Don't punish yourself, just go back to it. And so you start slowly and do it for a little bit of time, and then you can, as time goes on, because I think there is an invitation inside of each of us that wants to come to this place. Given the world that we live in, I remember hearing a bunch of years ago that certainly in the New York area where I lived for a long time, but I think it's true everywhere else, we receive on average 1,000 different messages a day from some electronic device, some which we don't hear, saying our hair needs to be a different color, our body needs to be a different shape, we need to buy this car, don't buy that car, vote for this person, by all means do not vote for that person. They keep coming at us. Why do they keep coming at us? Because they work and they capture our attention, even if we're not really paying focused attention on it. And so the challenge is to not to step out of it, because we can never step out of it, but to put ourselves in a different kind of place for a while. And Braver Angels creates an environment where people can do that in these conversations. Okay, if we're going to have a conversation, this is how we're going to do it. And there are all these norms that people have to sign off on. And every meeting it begins with those norms. And so people say yes. And if people can't say yes, well, then, they're going to opt out, or they'll be called out if they break the norm, which is not punitive. It's saying, oh, here's the accountability. We've all agreed to this. I think it's possible, but in our fast-paced world, it's just very, very hard to do that. And religious communities I think are learning. we often, well, the church that I grew up in, which I think is true for most people who grow up in a Christian church, grew up in the attractional model. In the Episcopal Church, if the church door was read, the music was on key, and the sermon was 15 minutes or less, people automatically came. And that was the church of my childhood. And everybody would nod their head. 40 years, that would be the case. Well, it's no longer the case because people don't know what's going on inside the church. They don't know what the church represents. And so the challenge for the church is to go out, not necessarily with a Bible at a street corner pointing to a passage, you need to believe this. No, go out and build relationships with people. Find out where else God is working, because there's not a square inch of ground on the face of the earth where God is not at work. And the challenge for us is to join God in that work. What the church has done, and I think all religious communities have done that, God is working in here, and we need to be with God in here because God is not working out there. Well, no, God is working out there, and God needs our help in the working out there. God is working in Ukraine right now. I don't want to go to Ukraine, but there are people who are. Not just people who are fighting the war, but people who are offering succor and support and help and all the rest of it. It's a dangerous place to be, but God is working there. God is working there, offering whatever God can, and God needs help. There are all sorts of places where God is present, but we don't think God is present because it's just so awful. Well, God is there too, grieving and weeping just like everyone else. And how can we join God in trying to bring what's been broken back to some kind of healing place, some kind of reconciliation? It's not going to happen all at once, but we need to be committed to it. And we need to be imbued with hope. One of my favorite definitions of hope comes from Jim Wallace, who is a founder of the Sojourners community and magazine in Washington, D.C., a writer, a Christian writer. He says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change.
So when you find yourself immersed in prayer, do you feel that you are communing with something external? And if so, does that differ from, say, a more mindful meditation in which you're simply sitting with yourself?
Well, I would say that they're very similar because I don't think I'm connecting with something external. I think I'm connecting with something that's internal, and something that's internal in everyone. That's the kind of the belief system that I have, the faith that I have, that we all have this capacity of this divine spark, this divine life that is in each and every one of us. And if people say they don't believe in God, I often think, well, it's probably a God that I don't believe in either, because it's a vengeful God, or it's a distant God, or it's a judging God in a heavy-handed way. I don't buy that God. No, but this divine light is in each of us. So when I'm in silence, I'm connecting to that spark, that presence that is in me, and to see it in everyone else. And we're trained, all of us are trained not to see it in someone else. If we didn't learn it at the kitchen table, we learned it on the playground. Sometimes we learned it in a religious community. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, think of your high school, or your better put, your middle school cafeteria. There was that table of kids that nobody else would sit with. And if you sat with them, your whole social world would collapse because you were sitting with the wrong side. And it could have been about race. More often than not, it was, every middle school had terms, geeks, nerds, losers, whatever. We all learned it. And the question is not how to get rid of it. The question is, how do we manage it? Where did it come from? How does it live in us? And what can we do to minimize it? And what I said earlier about the exchange of the peace, put your gift down, be reconciled to your brother or sister. And as the ancient spiritual writers, at least the Christian ones, said, see the presence of Christ in someone else. And that can be hard because there are people in my life, and my guess is there are people in your life, and there are people in all of our lives who said something to us, done something to us, and I don't want to see the presence of God in them. I just want to keep cursing them. And I've mortgaged a lot of my psyche in trying to, put them down, which doesn't do any good. One writer says resentment is drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick.
Mm.
And we again, a lot of certainly public leaders who traffic in resentment, and it will work for a while.
Yes, I think the analogy of our politics as a middle school cafeteria is fairly apt right now.
Yeah.
If your book is a universal call to action, how do you hope that secular folks or people who explicitly don't believe in Jesus will respond? What can they take away in their own lives?
Yeah, well, and I like to think it's not that churchy a book. And my editor was saying that they didn't want to just have it for a certain segment of the Jesus movement, namely the Episcopal Church. So I try to be more broad than that. One thing that I have a big bugaboo about is reference to the poor. And Jesus makes reference to the poor a lot in scriptures. And so we followed his example. And when he preaches in the synagogue, he said, the Lord has given, restore sight to the blind, the deaf will hear, the lame will walk, and the good, and the poor will have good news preached to them. And so what he's saying is the lame are going to walk, the blind are going to see, but the poor are going to have good news preached to them. Nothing's going to change. You're going to have good news preached to them. And when you use the term the poor, that's a catch-all phrase. And they're left without stories or names. We refer to the poor, preferential option for the poor. Well, what do we mean by the poor? And it's not a slur, but it almost is, because we're categorizing that, and most of us have been brought up with some sort of notion as to what the poor are. You can say people who are poor. A key component for this was me, was when I was in college. Bill Russell came to give a lecture. Bill Russell, who played for the Boston Celtics, won 9 NBA championships in 11 years, arguably one of the 5 best players of basketball ever. And he was huge. He's 6'10" or 6'11", but he was even more impressive in dignity. And he told the story. He was in an airport once, and he said some woman came up to him and said, "Oh, you're a basketball player." And he said very clearly and graciously, "No, madam, I'm a man who plays basketball." He would not be defined by his category. He wanted to be, his humanity came first. And so when we say the poor, we're in some ways denying their humanity. Or when we talk about underprivileged kids, I call that a linguistic cosmetic. And what happens is, and so much of mission, certainly in the Christian church over 400 years, is we need to do for people who don't have. So we give to people who don't have, do for them. And what that does is just reinforces the gap between those who have and those who don't. The challenge, and I talk about this a lot in my book, is the challenge is to be with. And you don't need to be a person of faith to do that. To be with that everyone has something to teach. These guys at the soup line, not all of them, but a lot of them, boy, they taught me, they were some of my most important teachers. And the culture would say, they don't have anything to teach me. Look at them. They're dirty. They live on the street or by the river under a tent or whatever. Why should we pay attention to them? Well, I paid attention to them, and I learned from many of them. Oh God, the level of courage. And some of them, one guy I remember said, have you read the 91st Psalm? I said, well, what's the 90? You got to read the 91st Psalm. So I go back to my office and read the 91st Psalm. Is about eagle's wings, that we're under eagle's wings. But it was a key portion of how he lived his life. And we're trained to see people in categories. And when we say they're the poor, we just keep them in a category, and we don't know their stories, don't want to know their stories. And we make it difficult for them to get out of that category of being economically poor. So it just, that's not just an argument or a claim for people just of faith, but for all of us. Another one that I use, I don't see the signs around so much anymore, but maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of lawn signs, hate has no home here. Hate has no home here. And I have a whole chapter on hate has no home here, because I wonder, well, what is this all about? And as I thought about it and pondered it, I realized there's a level of arrogance there. And I don't know any home that doesn't have an impulse at some time or another where somebody in the family, in the household, hates somebody else. The reason that all these drama shows and sitcoms have teenagers saying to their parents, I hate you, is because they feel it in that moment. I never said it to my parents, but there were several times when I felt it. And now, of course, the idea is it's referring to people who have hate as an ideology, that we're not going to allow that in. And the notion is hate has no home here. So you don't have a place to be. And that can lead to the notion, well, we shouldn't have people who hate. They shouldn't exist. One thing I learned when I was in seminary, a teacher, mentor, and friend was Henry Nouwen, who was written a bunch of books. He died about 10 years ago. And he said, when one thinks that someone cannot be redeemed, and the Nazis did that in Germany, the Jews could not be redeemed, so you get rid of them. When somebody cannot be redeemed, you end up with Auschwitz. And so hate has no home here. It's not saying that, but it's sort of leading in that direction. And people who have the sign, there's a level of self-righteousness. I don't hate, but they do. You can't come in here. And as Jesus said, you need to take the log out of your own eye. I mean, yeah, you're hating the hater, and that defeats the whole purpose. So it's a misguided statement. And again, one does not have to be a person of faith to see the inadequacy or the inappropriateness of that sign. I understand, we want to reduce hate. There are other lawn signs, and I had them in front of our house for a while. It was in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. No matter where you come from, you are my neighbor. It's a whole different way of looking at it.
Well, since Braver Angels is on the brink of launching its Braver Politics initiative to enter the political arena and begin to engage systematically with elected officials and candidates across the country, in our closing minutes here, I'd ask, what do you hope that our political leaders might take away from the themes in your book and the themes that Braver Angels and certain religious communities are cultivating across the country?
Well, I think, to hold people accountable, that the religious communities, I think, need to step out. I mean, reconciliations was the fundamental part, certainly the Christian church, and tikkun olam, the Hebrew term for repairing the world, surrender, in Islam. Those are the three Abrahamic faiths. We, each of us, need to be in the world marketplace and in the political arena, calling people to account. And the Braver Politics, I can't remember exactly what the four commitments that we're asking people who are running for office. What is it? 6,744 different elections from school board to Senate that we hope to engage in and to ask people to listen. And the candidates, at least the first step, they're all going to say yes to that, because to say no would put them at risk. Now, will they live up to that? How do we hold them to live up to that when they break the commitment that they say they're going to honor, is to listen to someone and not engage in vengeful dialogue? I wonder about that, but I'm glad we're engaging because the political world now is such that you only win by putting somebody else down, and that plays. People pay for it. People want to hear it because they want to sort of the fight flight kind of thing. I think we can aspire to something else, and it's really a challenge to change the culture. And it's often said by the folks who deal with systems in the business world that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So what we're trying to do, what Braver Angels is trying to do, along with a whole host of other groups, is to trying to change the culture. And that's hard work. And thank God that we're doing it. And thank God that there's support and solidarity for people who are doing it together. And when they get tired or they get discouraged or they feel beat down or they just want to go hide under a rock, they can do so because other people will take their place. But we need to come back and continue to do that. I think that's critical to who we are. And that's a role that citizens can play. That's an integral part of what it means to be a citizen. Typically, we think of citizenship as just whether or not you have the right to vote, which is critical to what it means to be a citizen. But there's so many other dimensions to that as well. And Braver Angels, I think, speaks to that and opens up possibilities for people to do that, to exercise their citizenship.
Yes. Well, I think that is a fine note on which to close. For listeners who want to dig further into these ideas, your book is called Seeing the Unseen: Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. It's available on Amazon, and I encourage everyone to get a copy. Mark Beckwith, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thanks for all you do with Braver Angels.
Thank you, Ciaran. I really appreciate it.